On a scorching afternoon, along a desolate southern highway, the luxury car of a wealthy businessman came to a sudden stop. Flat tire. No cell signal, no one around. And for the first time in years he felt something he'd long forgotten. Helplessness. Then, out of nowhere, a boy appeared. Wearing a faded t-shirt, worn-out sneakers, and a heart full of kindness that asked for nothing in return. From that one small moment, neither of them could have known their lives were about to change. Forever. This is a story you won't forget. Let's dive into this story. But before we begin, leave me a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to follow for more. The late afternoon sun cast a soft golden glow over the cracked pavement and whispering pines along a quiet stretch of road outside Birmingham, Alabama. Arthur Jennings, a white man in his 70s, sat quietly in his sleek charcoal-grey Lexus parked along the roadside, beads of sweat collecting on his forehead despite the hum of the air conditioning working overtime. He was a once renowned banker, now retired, living alone in a grand estate filled with expensive paintings and long, echoing hallways where laughter had long since faded. Today, for the first time in years, he found himself in a situation where money seemed meaningless. A sharp pop rang out as he'd driven along this empty country road. A flat tire, rear left. No cell signal, not a soul in sight. Only the steady drone of cicadas, the oppressive sun pouring down in waves, and the dry scent of scorched earth rising from the roadside. Arthur let out a long sigh, resting his head against the seat, his fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel. Tired, trembling, and frustrated. Never had he imagined he'd end up stranded in a place like this. No assistants, no employees, no one to call. The world he once controlled so effortlessly now felt just out of reach. And then, in the shimmering heat, a small figure appeared in the distance, moving slowly, one step at a time, like a mirage born from the sun's glare. A young black boy, maybe 13 or 14 years old, wearing a faded t-shirt, worn-out sneakers, and a frayed backpack. His name was Caleb, though Arthur didn't know that yet. All he saw was a skinny kid walking calmly under the blazing sky, a face marked by quiet resolve and eyes far wiser than his age. "Looks like you've got a flat," Caleb said, his voice clear and steady, neither nervous nor afraid. In the stillness, it rang out like a lifeline. Arthur nodded, feeling something strange stir inside, perhaps relief, maybe even a little shame. "Yeah, I tried calling for roadside assistance, but there's no signal. Nothing to do but wait, I guess." The boy smiled. An honest, confident smile. "I know how to change a tire. My granddad taught me last summer." "You got a spare?" Arthur pointed to the trunk, his eyes fixed on the boy, half curious, half stunned, as Caleb calmly opened it, pulled out the tools, and got to work. The soft clink of metal, the creak of the wheel being lifted, and the breeze whispering through the pine trees, all blended into an unexpectedly peaceful scene. And in that moment, on that forgotten road, Arthur Jennings, once a man of status and control, felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Selfless kindness. The kind he'd spent a lifetime forgetting. Arthur stood silently by his car, watching every movement the boy made. Caleb didn't speak much. His focus was total. His small, sun-darkened hands moved with surprising confidence as he loosened each lug nut, removed the flat, and fitted the spare tire, like he'd done it 100 times before. The soft clink of metal echoed rhythmically through the still Alabama countryside, like a simple melody carried on the breeze, which brought with it the scent of dry grass and the distant flutter of sparrows in the pines. Arthur, who had once managed multi-million-dollar deals in high-stakes meetings, felt a strange stirring inside. Humility. Maybe even shame. He had spent years in a world where everything came with a price. Every handshake was a negotiation, every conversation a strategy. But this boy expected nothing. No payment, no praise, just help, freely given. "You're really good at this," Arthur said, his voice low, measured, trying to mask the unease rising in his chest. Caleb stood up, wiped his hands on his worn jeans, sweat dotting his brow, though his eyes were bright and steady. "All done, sir. You can check it if you want." Arthur reached into his wallet, pulling out a few bills. Not much by his standards, but it was how he'd always expressed gratitude. "Thank you, here. Grab yourself something to drink." But Caleb shook his head, lifting one hand politely in refusal. "That's all right, sir. I helped because I wanted to." That's all. Those words, simple, sincere, landed softly but powerfully, like a quiet slap to Arthur's pride. He stood there, money still in hand, while Caleb turned and walked away, his slender frame shrinking into the glow of the setting sun, leaving Arthur alone with thoughts he hadn't faced in years. Back in the driver's seat, Arthur rested his hands on the steering wheel, but didn't start the engine right away. He looked into the rear-view mirror. The boy had left no name, no phone number, no request. Nothing but a quiet act of kindness that weighed heavily on his heart. And in that moment, Arthur understood. Some things cannot be bought. Goodness, grace, selfless humanity, the very things he had somehow lost on his way to becoming successful. The Lexus rolled forward slow and steady. But Arthur's mind had already begun a different journey, one that wasn't about wealth or power, but about finding his way back to the simplest truths of life. That night, in his grand estate on the outskirts of Birmingham, Arthur Jennings sat alone in his study, surrounded by silence so complete it felt like a presence of its own. The antique grandfather clock ticked softly. Tick-tock, its sound echoing gently against the oak-panelled walls. Warm light from the brass desk lamp bathed his weathered hands resting on the arms of his chair. A glass of red wine shimmered on the table nearby, untouched. Everything around him was still, except his thoughts. The image of Caleb lingered in his mind, sharp and vivid. Worn-down sneakers, a faded t-shirt, a small frame with a gaze far too steady for a boy his age. Not the kind of confidence built in boardrooms or stock markets, but the kind that came from something deeper. Character, and a quiet strength that didn't need to shout. Arthur glanced around the room, the shelves lined with books collecting dust, a $1,000 oil painting hanging silently on the wall, the mahogany desk polished to perfection but barren of any warmth. He suddenly felt cold, achingly alone. Everything he had built, his wealth, his influence, his name, felt hollow compared to the simple, sincere smile of a boy with nothing to offer but kindness. The next morning, before the sun had burned through the last of the morning mist, Arthur picked up his car keys and drove off, saying nothing to anyone. He didn't know exactly what he was searching for. Perhaps it was a thank you he hadn't yet spoken. Perhaps it was a sense of closure. Or maybe he simply needed to understand why a small act from a stranger had reached so deep into his heart. He returned to the same road where the tire had blown the day before. The sky was clearer now, and the cicadas had resumed their steady song among the trees. Arthur drove slowly, scanning every dirt path, every open field, hoping to see that small silhouette again. He stopped at a gas station and asked the young man wiping down windshields, "Have you seen a black boy, maybe 13 or so, small frame, old backpack, walking through here?" The man shook his head. "Can't say I have." Arthur continued on. He pulled into a small roadside diner where the scent of fresh pastries filled the warm, cozy space. Plates clinked gently and silverware tapped against ceramic. After a few polite questions, a woman with silver hair tied neatly behind her head looked up from behind the counter, her eyes lighting up as she listened to his description. "Sounds like you're talking about Caleb," she said with a soft smile, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's my grandson. He's always helping folks. He lives with his mama over in South Ridge, west side of the city." Arthur stood still for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Caleb," he repeated under his breath. A simple name, but it unlocked something deep in him. Not just the desire to thank a boy who had helped him, but the beginning of a search far more important. A search to rediscover something he'd left behind long ago. Himself. The road leading into South Ridge was uneven and full of potholes. On either side stood small, weather-worn homes with faded paint and wooden siding peeling from years of sun and rain. Arthur Jennings, still dressed in his usual tailored grey suit, felt oddly out of place among this quiet, working-class neighborhood. In the distance, dogs barked, children laughed, and the smell of someone cooking dinner drifted gently through the late afternoon air. He stopped his car in front of a modest house at the end of a narrow lane. Grey wooden walls, a rusted tin roof, but the front yard was clean and neatly swept, with a few bright flower pots adding life to the porch. Arthur took a deep breath, his heart beating slow and heavy. He had never knocked on a door like this before. Not because he thought he was above it, but because his life had always existed in a separate world. And yet here, under the weight of the Alabama sun and the scent of old wood, he felt smaller, and somehow more real than he had in years. 3 soft knocks. A moment later the door cracked open. A woman in her 40s stood behind it, lean, with her hair pulled back simply. Her eyes held a mix of caution and quiet curiosity. "Sorry to bother you," Arthur began, his voice gentler than he expected. "My name is Arthur Jennings. Yesterday I had a flat tire on a road just outside town, and your son, Caleb, helped me." The woman paused, then her lips curled into a faint smile. "That sounds like Caleb," she said, her tone warm. "He's always helping strangers. He's out back, working on the fence." She invited Arthur in. The house was humble but spotless. The sofa was worn, a few old photos and childlike drawings, surely Caleb's, lined the walls. It wasn't polished, but it breathed something his mansion never had: warmth. A little chaos, perhaps, but the kind that came from love. They stepped into the backyard. Caleb was crouched near the gate, hammering a warped plank back into place. At the sound of footsteps, he looked up. His eyes widened in surprise at the sight of Arthur. "I didn't think you'd come back," Caleb said with a sheepish grin, clearly flustered but genuinely happy. Arthur nodded, stepping forward. "I thought a lot about you last night, about how you helped me without asking for anything. It moved me." Caleb looked down, shoulders shrugging slightly. "I just did what felt right, sir." Arthur looked into the boy's eyes, sincere, unguarded, with no expectation of praise. And in that moment, a complex feeling stirred in his chest. Gratitude, yes, but also a deep, quiet ache. Somehow this boy had given him more than just roadside help. He had given him something far greater, a reminder of what truly mattered. "I want to do something for you and your mum," Arthur said, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. "Not because you need it, but because it's the only right thing I can do." Caleb didn't respond right away. He wasn't used to men in suits talking to him like this, with respect, with genuine sincerity. But in the softening light of dusk, the distance between their 2 worlds seemed to shrink. In the quiet, 2 people stood face to face, not banker and boy, not wealthy and poor, but simply 2 human beings, joined for a reason neither of them had planned, but both could feel deep in their bones. In the days that followed, for reasons even he couldn't fully explain, Arthur Jennings found himself returning to South Ridge more and more often. At first, he told himself it was simply to make sure Caleb's family had everything they needed, that it was a gesture of gratitude, nothing more. But the more time he spent there, the clearer it became. What he was chasing wasn't repayment, it was connection. Something he hadn't felt in years. Caleb hadn't changed. He was still the same boy, with the sincere smile, worn clothes, and eyes that sparkled with curiosity. But it was exactly that constancy, Caleb's unshaken goodness, that made Arthur feel strangely at ease. He was no longer Mr. Jennings, the distant, wealthy man with a perfect tie knot and too many zeros in his account. He was simply an old man, trying to find meaning again through the clear, honest eyes of a child. One afternoon, when Arthur came by, he found Caleb standing in the corner of the yard with one of the construction workers, listening intently as the man explained how to measure and cut wood with precision. The worker was Joe, a broad-shouldered man with a kind voice and the patience of someone who enjoyed teaching. "You interested in construction?" Arthur asked as he walked over. Caleb nodded, eyes lighting up. "Yes, sir. I like seeing things come together from numbers and hands. It's like turning ideas into something real." Arthur chuckled softly. After all those years in finance, he had almost forgotten what that kind of pure enthusiasm felt like. Doing something not for profit, but for the simple love of it. In that moment, he saw a version of himself long buried. Once a dreamer, before the world nudged him into chasing status instead of purpose. From that day on, Arthur made arrangements for Caleb to learn more from the crew. Every afternoon after school, Caleb would roll up his sleeves and dive in, asking questions, learning how to mix cement, measure frames, apply coats of paint. His shoes were worn and his hands still clumsy, but his eyes gleamed with pride each time he stood beside the men building a stronger roof over his family. Arthur didn't just watch from afar, he pitched in. He carried buckets, stacked lumber, and sometimes just sat with Caleb during their breaks, sipping lemonade and talking about life. In those small acts, a quiet bond began to form, tied not by obligation or money, but by mutual respect and something even deeper: trust. He began to understand that this connection wasn't born out of fleeting compassion. It was rooted in something far greater, a yearning to give back, not with wealth, but with presence, with time, with effort, with the kind of attention a boy like Caleb deserved, not as a project, not as a cause, but as a person, someone worth standing beside every step of the way. One late afternoon, as the golden sunlight spilled over South Ridge like honey, Arthur Jennings sat quietly on an old wooden chair beneath Caleb's front porch. The glass of iced tea in his hand had mostly melted, just water now, but he hadn't touched it. Before him, he watched Caleb, fumbling and focused, working with Uncle Joe to rebuild the backyard gate. The sound of wood knocking against wood, the rhythmic thunk-thunk of a hammer, and bursts of laughter floating through the still, warm air filled Arthur with a peace he hadn't known in years. In nearly 80 years of life, Arthur had sat at opulent boardroom tables, owned things others only dreamed of, yachts, real estate, prestige, but never, not once, had he felt the kind of pure joy he now found in these quiet moments, seeing a boy's smile when he learned to measure a piece of wood just right, or hearing Caleb's mother whisper a heartfelt thank you because, for the first time in a while, dinner would be warm and plentiful. Each evening, when he returned to his grand estate, it no longer felt like a home. The walls adorned with priceless art now seemed cold, silent in a way that echoed. He realized then that in chasing profit and applause, he had confined his life to a luxurious box. Elegant, but empty. One night he sat in his study, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting a quiet pool of light. In front of him lay a fresh set of blueprints. Designs for Caleb's home. He'd asked a friend, a retired architect, to help him draw it up. This wasn't just about fixing a porch or replacing a gate anymore. This was about building something solid, from the ground up, not just with materials, but with humanity. This is what truly matters, Arthur whispered to himself, his hand trembling slightly as he traced the pencil lines. Not because I can, but because I want to. Since meeting Caleb, he no longer saw helping others as charity. It had become part of him, an extension of a self he thought he had long forgotten. It was as though old age had given him a second chance, not merely to exist, but to live. Arthur began visiting the neighborhood more often, not just to oversee the renovations, but to sit with Caleb, to listen to his dreams. Dreams of becoming an engineer one day, of building something strong for his mother, and for others. That boy had given him something he thought was gone forever. Energy, purpose, a quiet, unshakable faith in people and in himself. For the first time in many, many years, Arthur Jennings no longer felt like a man winding down. He felt like a man just beginning a life that finally meant something. On a bright Sunday morning, South Ridge felt livelier than usual. Neighbors gathered around the small house at the end of the lane, the one that used to have a rusted tin roof and weathered siding. Now it stood warm and welcoming. A fresh tiled roof, soft cream-colored walls, a sturdy porch with polished wooden steps, and a small swing where Caleb still sat each evening, gently rocking back and forth. People brought fresh-baked pies, jars of homemade jam, and wildflowers tied in twine. Humble gifts, overflowing with affection. Laughter echoed through the yard, mingled with greetings and the happy bark of dogs. It felt like a festival. A a celebration not just of a house renewed, but of something greater: hope, community, and rebirth. In the front yard, Caleb ran from group to group, grinning ear to ear as he showed his friends around. "This is the new window. You can see the oak tree out back from here," he shouted, his voice full of excitement, his eyes sparkling like a child who'd just unwrapped his very first Christmas gift. Arthur Jennings stood on the porch, holding a glass of sweet tea Caleb's mother had handed him. The tailored grey suit he was once known for was gone, replaced by a simple cotton shirt and worn-in khaki pants. He wasn't a distant businessman anymore. Today he looked like a father, a neighbor, a part of this place. Caleb's mother stepped up beside him, eyes red with emotion. "You didn't just fix this house," she said, her voice trembling. "You brought back something I thought we'd lost. Faith. In others. In the future. I don't think you realize what you've done." Arthur smiled softly, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You and Caleb gave me something I didn't even know I was missing. What it feels like to live a life built on real values." Just then Caleb came bounding up, face radiant with joy. "Monsieur Arthur, I've been thinking. When I grow up, I want to do what you did. Help people. Rebuild what they've lost." Arthur bent down slightly, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder, his eyes shining with quiet pride. "You've already started, Caleb. You helped me first. Without you, I never would have understood what real kindness looks like." The sun dipped lower, casting a warm golden glow across the little street. The three of them, Arthur, Caleb, and his mother, sat together on the porch steps, watching the neighborhood children play in the yard. No more words were needed. Between them was a silence, not empty but full of meaning, comfort, and peace. Arthur knew that when his time came, no one would speak of his bank accounts or his business victories, but maybe, somewhere in a small corner of the world, there would be a boy named Caleb, who would tell the story of an old man who taught him that giving without expecting is the only way to truly live. There are things in life that money simply can't buy, and kindness is one of them. In today's world, it's easy to get swept up in the chase for success, status, and material gain. We measure our worth, and the worth of others, by what we own: degrees, possessions, influence. But one day, maybe in the silence of a big, empty house, or in a quiet moment when a stranger offers unexpected help, we're reminded the true meaning of life isn't about what we have, but about what we give. The story of Arthur Jennings and young Caleb is a quiet, powerful reminder of that truth. An aging man, once a decision-maker in towering boardrooms, is rescued not by wealth or legacy, but by a boy with no riches, no title, just a kind heart and honest hands. That single act of selfless help didn't just fix a tire. It realigned the course of a life that had long forgotten what it meant to truly live. What connects us, in the end, isn't power or prestige. It's how we treat one another, especially when no one's watching. A timely question, a warm smile, a small good deed expecting nothing in return. These are the quiet sparks that can ignite something much greater, in someone else's heart and in our own. Because sometimes the ones who seem to have everything are the ones most in need of being awakened, not by grand lessons, but by pure moments of kindness, from the most unexpected places. And in our own lives, maybe that's all it takes. To choose to show up, to care, not because we have to, but because we can. Because even the smallest act of goodness can begin a change we never saw coming, not just in the one receiving it, but in the one who gives it. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I've poured a lot of time, heart, and soul into creating emotional stories like this one, and your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for joining me on this journey.